Mikwendaagoziwag. Mikwendaagoziwag is an Ojibwe word that means in English, they are remembered. This is how the plaque reads at Sandy Lake, Minnesota. The huge boulder is a proud memorial to the 19th century Ojibwe people who were determined to stay in their homeland forever. It is a reminder of the past and the sacrifices they made. This is their story. The Upper Great Lakes region of North America is where most Ojibwe people live. The Ojibwe people are also known as the Chippewa or Anishinaabe. The stories passed down from generation to generation describe how they came to this region from the East Coast along the waterways until they reached Lake Superior. They survived for centuries on the gifts of the waters and the land. They moved their camp from season to season to hunt, fish, and gather the resources that were needed. Survival was difficult in the harsh northern climate. They maintained a strong spiritual connection to their animal and plant relatives. They strove for a life that was in balance. They took only what they needed, used all of it, and shared or traded what they gathered with others. Around 1660, the French ventured along the Upper Great Lakes and into Ojibwe territory. They wanted to trade with the tribes to get the skins of animals that were fashionable for clothing in Europe. They especially wanted beaver skins for hats. Later, the British fur companies came to the region also to get the furs. They established posts throughout the Great Lakes region where goods were traded and furs were packed and shipped to Europe. The Europeans brought many useful objects to trade with the Ojibwe. Some things they brought were metal kettles, blades, guns, beads, and blankets to trade with the Ojibwe for the furs. The Ojibwe adopted these new items because they made work more efficient. They became so accustomed to these trade items that eventually they relied on these trade goods to survive. Thus, they became increasingly dependent on the British and French, who were the only ones who supplied these goods. Over time, the numbers of Europeans in the region grew, and some decided to stay and build homes. When the Constitution of the United States was ratified in 1787, early American leaders recognized the tribes as sovereign nations in the Constitution. In the Upper Great Lakes region, U.S. authorities chose to negotiate treaties with them to secure natural resources and land for settlements. One of the treaties that the United States negotiated early on with the Ojibwe was the Treaty of 1837, also called the Pine Treaty, whereby the U.S. government secured vast timber resources for lumber needed in the growing cities. In return, the Ojibwe received goods and money called annuity payments, and they retained the right to hunt, fish, and gather on the territory they ceded to the United States. These rights were called usufructuary rights and were guaranteed as long as the president was pleased with the behavior of the Ojibwe. The Treaty of 1842 was negotiated next and signed at Madeline Island. This treaty gave the government access to the minerals, including the valuable copper in the region. This was called the Copper Treaty and provided for annuity payments to Ojibwe tribal members each year in the summer at LaPointe on Madeline Island. This treaty also included provisions guaranteeing the usufructuary rights of the Ojibwe to hunt, fish, and gather on the land they had ceded to the government, and to the continued right to remain on their homeland. Both of these treaties had important clauses that would allow the president to revoke the usufructuary rights and to remove the Ojibwe westward to unceded lands. However, the government translators in the 1842 treaty negotiations assured the Ojibwe leaders that the president would never require removal as long as the Ojibwe were peaceful with their white neighbors. Even though the peace had never been broken between the Ojibwe and the settlers in the region, just 5 years after the 1842 treaty, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sent staff to LaPointe on Madeline Island to plan the required resettlement of certain Ojibwe bands to lands west of the Mississippi. Hearing of this intention, Ojibwe headmen greatly objected to any removal idea. A delegation of Ojibwe leaders, including Biizhike, also known as Chief Buffalo of the LaPointe Band, went to Washington, D.C. in 1848. They presented a pictograph and petition to President Polk that showed their unity of heart and mind to never leave their homeland. They were assured by the president that they would not have to move. Only 2 years later, this promise was broken. Contrary to explicit promises made at treaty negotiations in 1842, and the Ojibwe leaders' understanding of the treaty, the new president, Zachary Taylor, signed an illegal order requiring the prompt removal of all Ojibwe people from Michigan and Wisconsin to unceded lands west of the Mississippi River in Minnesota. He also tried to revoke all the hunting, fishing, and gathering rights in the ceded territories that the Ojibwe needed to survive. His attempt to invoke this removal order was based on language written in the treaties regarding presidential power. Since there had been only peace between the Ojibwe and their white neighbors, presidential authority was not properly exercised. Ojibwe leaders wondered why President Taylor would do this. What was his motive? Minnesota Territorial Governor Alexander Ramsey and Indian agent John Watrous successfully persuaded President Taylor to order the Ojibwe to move to Minnesota so annuity payments would be received in the Minnesota Territory. They hoped this would bring new economic growth to the territory and hastened the march to Minnesota statehood. Indian agent John Watrous informed tribal members that the next treaty annuity payments would occur at Sandy Lake, Minnesota in late October of 1850. He explained in a letter to the governor that the late date in the fall would likely overlap with the onset of winter, thus preventing the Ojibwe from returning to their homelands. Whether Agent Watrous foresaw the tragic consequences of his plan is unclear. However, he clearly hoped that winter would trap the Ojibwe at Sandy Lake. Some Ojibwe bands further east in Michigan refused to go. Thousands of Ojibwe from Wisconsin and Minnesota traveled to Sandy Lake unaware of what was about to happen that fateful fall of 1850. They fully expected to return home that season and were unprepared for the approaching winter. Government agents drastically underestimated the amount of food needed and the time it would take for provisions to arrive at Sandy Lake to feed the Ojibwe. Congress also did not act quickly enough to appropriate necessary funds for payments to the Ojibwe at Sandy Lake. Though Indian agent Watrous knew the provisions and payments would not arrive at Sandy Lake on time, he did not stop the Ojibwe from coming by canceling or rescheduling the annuity payments. The consequences of his inaction would be dire for the Ojibwe people en route to Sandy Lake. More than 5,000 Ojibwe men, women, and children traveled by canoe and by foot hundreds of miles to Sandy Lake, Minnesota. Tired and hungry, they arrived at Sandy Lake to find no food, no shelter, and no annuity payments. As Agent Watrous predicted, winter took hold while they were waiting. Rivers and lakes froze. Ojibwe people struggled in the cold, and some burned their canoes to keep warm. They asked for the promised provisions and were only given meager rations of moldy flour and rancid pork. Many fell ill from the rotten food and diseases. Measles and dysentery spread quickly through the weakened camps. Many Ojibwe people died from starvation, illness, and exposure as they waited more than 6 weeks for Watrous to arrive with the annuity payments. Approximately 170 Ojibwe people died waiting at Sandy Lake due to this disastrous scheme. In early December 1850, they received only a portion of the annuity payments with some food and goods that were inadequate even for the journey home. Those who were still alive started the long trek home as they had always intended. They walked through ice and snow, weighed down by sorrow and anger, but determined to reach their communities. As many as 230 Ojibwe died on that long winter trek back home. The Sandy Lake tragedy stands out in history as one of the greatest losses of Ojibwe lives. That it came as a result of an illegal governmental scheme makes it that much more devastating.
I saw evidences of a terrible calamity everywhere. All over the cleared land, graves were to be seen in every direction, for miles distant from Sandy Lake. They were to be found in the woods, too. Some were interred by their friends on their way home. So alarming was the mortality that the Indians could not bury their dead.
When word came of the tragedy, Ojibwe leaders and citizens in the northern Great Lakes region expressed their outrage.
We believe we express the conviction of the entire population of the Lake Superior country in regarding this removal as uncalled for by the best interests of the government, the whites, or the Indians.
The Ojibwe became more resolved than ever to stay in their homelands. Outraged Ojibwe leaders and Lake Superior citizens petitioned the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., President Taylor had died in 1850 and was succeeded by Millard Fillmore. Consequently, Agent John Watrous was ordered to suspend the removal of the Ojibwe until further notice. Watrous ignored this order, did not inform the tribes about it, and continued to demand that the Ojibwe relocate to Minnesota. In response, 28 headmen of the Ojibwe Nation sent a petition late in 1851 to Minnesota Territorial Governor Alexander Ramsey asking permission to meet with the President in Washington about this issue. They received no reply. By the spring of 1852, they had waited long enough. Biizhike, the well-known 92-year-old leader of the LaPointe Ojibwe, also known as Chief Buffalo, set out in a 24-foot birch bark canoe from Madeline Island to Washington, D.C. With him was Chief Oshaga, interpreter Benjamin Armstrong, and 4 other Ojibwe headmen determined to meet President Fillmore, whether they had permission for the trip or not. The inspired group worked their way east along the south shore of Lake Superior, with stops at Ontonagon, Houghton, Hancock, and Marquette in Michigan. Along the way, they circulated a petition in support of the Ojibwe cause. Merchants, lumbermen, and copper miners made donations for their trip and endorsed the document with a great many signatures intended for President Fillmore. Battling severe storms, they persevered as far as Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, where they boarded the steamship Northerner. They traveled by steamship through Lakes Huron and St. Clair before reaching Detroit and later crossing Lake Erie. They eventually arrived at Buffalo, New York, where they traveled by train and steamer to New York City and finally overland to Washington, D.C. Their brave trip lasted 10 long, perilous weeks since leaving LaPointe on Madeline Island. When they finally arrived, they met with the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, who told them to turn around and go home. Defiantly, they stayed and waited for an opportunity to meet with the president. Fortunately, in a restaurant, they met New York Congressman George Briggs, who was impressed by Biizhike and his companions. He quickly arranged a meeting for the delegation with President Millard Fillmore the following day. Biizhike began the meeting with a pipe ceremony using a pipe that was made specifically for this visit with the president. After everyone had smoked the pipe, Oshaga presented an oratory explaining how the Ojibwe understood the promises and agreements in the treaties of 1837 and 1842. They understood from these treaties that they would never be required to leave their homelands as long as they maintained peace with the white settlers in the region. They presented the president with the petition bearing the numerous signatures collected along the route of their journey. Chief Oshaga went on to explain the Sandy Lake tragedy and the treachery of Indian Agent Watros and Governor Ramsey. He concluded his speech asking for an end to the removal order once and for all. President Fillmore said he would consider their situation and speak to them again when he had come to a decision. A couple of days later, he recalled the group to the White House, telling them that the removal order would be revoked and annuity payments would return to LaPointe on Madeline Island. Satisfied with the president's assurances, Biizhike and the delegation traveled the long way home, sharing the good news. Upon his return to LaPointe, Biizhike shared the message of President Fillmore with the other Ojibwe headmen. The removal order was dead and finished. The Ojibwe leaders had achieved their goal to remain in their homelands. Former Indian agent John Watros had to answer to charges of fraud and deception. 2 years later, on Madeline Island, Biizhike and other Ojibwe headmen signed the Treaty of 1854 that guaranteed the Ojibwe permanent reservations in their homelands. In exchange, they gave up mineral rights along the north shore of Lake Superior and additional lands. In this treaty, they also reserved the usufructuary rights to hunt, fish, and gather on the lands they ceded to the government. They would never be ordered to leave their homelands again. This was a major victory for the Ojibwe that would impact their people for generations into the future. Shortly after signing the 1854 treaty, the Ojibwe lost their forceful leader Biizhike, who was buried on Madeline Island. In the decades to follow, few Ojibwe returned to Sandy Lake, Minnesota, or spoke of the terrible tragedy that occurred there. Many painful memories like these were buried deep in their hearts. These were challenging times for the Ojibwe, who were adapting to change while struggling to keep their cultural traditions alive. For more than a century, the story of the Sandy Lake tragedy was not commonly known. But contemporary Ojibwe leaders felt compelled to honor those who perished as the tragedy unfolded and make sure their story will never be forgotten.
Today, December 2nd of 2000, it's 150 years later from December 2nd of 1850 when Ojibwe people from the east started on their trek back home after trying to receive their annuities here. Early in October they arrived here and they were put on a waterlogged section of land and given rotten provisions that led to their deaths. And so we are dedicating and commemorating this memorial to remember that event. And then we're also having a symbolic run, a spiritual run called the Mikwendaagoziwag run, which means remember them. And so this memorial and the run are ways of remembering those events.
Composed of a huge granite boulder, the monument has plaques on its base naming the 19 annuity bands whose members came to Sandy Lake in 1850 and the 12 present-day successor bands of the Ojibwe. A section from the bottom of the same granite boulder was placed in the Ojibwe Memorial Park on Madeline Island, Wisconsin, in recognition of the Ojibwe who stalwartly returned home. It also honors those who undertook the rigorous trip to Washington, D.C., resulting in the 1854 treaty that was signed on Madeline Island, guaranteeing permanent homelands for the Ojibwe. Mikwendaagoziwag, they are remembered.